This video is sponsored by Ocoopa hand warmers. Shop drawers. We're all going to make them eventually, and these can be really intimidating for the beginning woodworker. But today we're going to demystify them by making a variety of different types. So let's get into it. So even woodworkers that have been around for a bit all tend to dread the last piece of a cabinet build, and that's creating all the drawers that you'll need for those cabinets. And I'm no exclusion. I've just recently built some cabinets for my shop, and I've been putting off making drawers for these cabinets for well over 3 weeks. And here's a quick look at one of the sides of these cabinets. As you can see, I've got a lot of voids here, and I'd like to fill up some of these voids with some drawers. And I've got 10 of these to build, so I've got a lot of work ahead of me. So I thought this would be the perfect time to go over some of the methods for building cabinet drawers. So what's the first thing that we need to think about when building drawers? Well, the first thing that I like to do is to measure the void that we're trying to fill. As you can see here, I've already got my face frame installed, so the measurements for the width and the height need to be referenced off of that face frame. So I'll quickly measure that width, which comes in at just a little under 21 inches. After that, we can measure the height, which comes in at 27 inches. And obviously, the last dimension that we're going to need is the depth. And since I want these drawers to be flush with the face frame, I'm going to measure from the back of the cabinet all the way up to the front of the face frame. And here I get a measurement of 23 5/16. Now that I have my workable void figured out, I always like to jot it down on a piece of paper. And here's a look at that sketch with all my workable space for those drawers drawn out and all the dimensions clearly labeled. Now that we have all those dimensions, we now need to start thinking about what we're going to build those drawers with. The first thing that I like to figure out is what type of drawer slides am I going to use with these drawers. And there really are two types that I typically use. One of the more common types are these side mount drawer slides. And those work great, and they can be found in any big box store. However, they can be a little bit tricky to install if you don't get your measurements for width exactly right. So instead, I like to go for a little bit more forgiving drawer slide. And that is the bottom mount drawer slide. These give you just a little bit more flexibility since the bottom of the drawer will sit right on top of the slides. Instead of having to have your width dead on, since there's a little bit of space on either side of the rails, it gives you just a little bit more flexibility. Now places like Rockler and Woodcraft have some high-end drawer slides like this, but frankly, they are outrageously priced. But I've had some really good luck on buying these slides off of Amazon, and I typically buy them in bulk, in packs of 10 or more. Not only do they tend to work just as well as some of those high-end brands like Bloom, but they're pennies on the dollar, and I just can't pass that up when I have multiple of these to install. And I'm not affiliated with any of this hardware, but I will leave some links to some brands that I've tried out in the past, and they seem to work just as well. And for the drawers we're making today, I'm going to be using undermount slides. So now that we know what type of slides we're using, we need to figure out what type of wood we're using for the drawers. And when I make drawer boxes, I typically only use two types of plywood, 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch for the bottom. And we'll be building all our drawers today with this material. So let's not waste any more time and build our first drawer. So let's go back to our drawing and figure out what dimension these boxes need to be to accommodate our drawer slides as well as the thickness of plywood we're using. So let's first start off with the height of these drawers. Since I have 27 inches to work with and I know I want 3 drawers in each one of these voids, the maximum height that I can have for any drawer would be about 9 inches. Now 9 inches obviously isn't going to work, as that doesn't account for any spacing in between each drawer, nor does it account for any hardware we use. On the other hand, however, our drawer fronts will probably be a lot closer to that 9-inch height. But for me, when I'm making my boxes, I like to subtract out a couple of inches. So I'm going to go with a 7-inch height for these drawers. Now that we've figured out the height, let's talk about the width. And this is a pretty easy calculation for me. Since we have 21 inches across, if I subtract a 1/2 of an inch, this will give me a 1/4 inch wiggle room on either side of the cabinet. The last dimension is the easiest to figure out, and that's the depth of the drawer, and that's completely determined by the drawer slides that you purchase. In the case of my drawer slides, it's 533 millimeters, which is exactly 21 inches. So let's build some drawer boxes, and we're going to build drawers in 4 different ways, starting from the easiest way to the most difficult way, and then we'll build all the rest using the preferred method. Before we build our first drawer box, we first need to understand how the plywood should be positioned within the box. And here's a bird's eye view of the first box we're going to create. As you can see, it has that depth of 21 inches as well as the width of 20 1/2. Now the real thing to pay attention to here is how the wood is positioned in the front and the back of the drawer. As you can see, the front and the back of the drawer are butted up against the sides of the drawer. Now the real reason that we want to have the wood in this position is so that the plies on that plywood are only showing in the front and the back of the drawer. Let me show you an example. So this is the positioning that you want to have with that plywood on your drawer. As you can see on the very front of the drawer, you can see those plies of plywood. And you can also see those plies on the very back of the drawer. But if we look at the side of the drawer, you can see it's completely clean with no visible plies. And that's exactly the layout that we're going for. And that's because no one is ever going to see the back of this drawer. They're also never going to see the front of this drawer. And that's because as soon as we're done building this box, we're going to put a drawer face on it that will cover up all those plies. And if we position the plywood in the other way, you can see there's a big difference. Even when we put that drawer front on, all those plies will be exposed on the side. So it's extremely important to pay attention to this as you're laying out your boxes, as this will affect the dimensions of each side of the drawer. Speaking of which, let's start to cut out our pieces for our first drawer box. So if we go back to our drawing, you'll see that we need two sides that are 21 inches long by 7 inches high. We'll also need a front and back that's 19.5 inches long by 7 inches high. Now the reason it's 19.5 inches is because the plywood we're going to be using is a 1/2 inch thick. So we have to subtract out 1 full inch. So one of the first things that we'll do is to cut out a bunch of 7-inch strips on this plywood. This 7-inch strip will ensure that all our drawer boxes have the exact same height at exactly 7 inches. And I tried to use up every bit of scrap 1/2 inch plywood that I had in my shop. The nice thing about cutting out all these strips is to make sure that all of our drawer boxes come together nicely at each corner. If you wait to cut down these strips at different times, you're just opening yourself up to having two sides that don't fit perfectly together. Before we move on, I'd like to take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, Ocoopa hand warmers. Now this is a sponsor to which I've been a customer for years, and that's mainly due to two reasons: woodworking and soccer. You see, all of my kids play soccer, and here in Indiana, the soccer season lasts from late fall to early winter. And let me tell you, they don't cancel their games for anything. Whether it's raining or snowing, they're still gonna play. It gets cold. So cold, in fact, my wife and I used to go to the car to warm up during those soccer games. That is until one year I purchased her a stocking stuffer from Ocoopa. And it's these two little hand warmers that single-handedly allowed us to enjoy those soccer games. But soccer wasn't the only use that I had for these hand warmers. You see, I didn't always have this beautiful climate-controlled shop. And before I could keep my shop at a comfortable 70 degrees all winter long, I relied on those hand warmers to keep me warm during those cold winter months. In fact, I can still remember the comments from viewers saying they could see my breath in the shop. So when Ocoopa approached me to check out one of their latest models, the UT4 Extreme, I couldn't say no. So let's take a look at this Ocoopa UT4 Extreme and see what comes with it. So inside the box, you're going to get a few items. You're going to get the hand warmer itself, along with a USB-C charging cord, a wrist strap, and a carrying pouch. So let's take a quick tour of this UT4 Extreme unit. If we look at the top of the unit, you'll notice there's a power button as well as an LED status indicator. And on one side of the unit, you'll also notice a side power button. And as you may have noticed, it's this button that has an amazing feature that I haven't seen on any other hand warmer. That's right, there's a flashlight on the very end of this unit, and it also has a strobe function. If we flip the unit around, on the opposite side of that side power button, there's more functionality. And that is a USB-A or USB-C port to charge your phone or tablet. And it's also that USB-C port that allows you to charge the hand warmer itself. So what sets this Ocoopa UT4 apart from other hand warmers? Well, first off, this warmer is completely shock-proof. With its rubber perimeter and protected corners, you can be assured that this warmer is going to last a while even in tough environments like your wood shop. But not only are these warmers shock-proof, but they're also waterproof and dust-proof, perfect for outdoor enthusiasts or woodworkers. And all Ocoopa hand warmers are UL certified for safety. And if you're extra cold, there's actually a heat boost with this UT4 unit. With a simple long press of the side button, you can unleash a burst of heat that's 40% hotter and warms up faster than the standard mode. And with its robust 10,000 milliampere battery, this hand warmer offers up to 16 hours of continuous warmth. And not only is there that extra boost heat with the side button, but there's also 3 standard levels of heat as well. making this the first professional hand warmer designed for outdoor use and tougher environments. So check out the links below and use the promo code in the description to see how you can get 10% off this amazing hand warmer. So whether or not you're using this for hunting, ice fishing, hiking, or even woodworking, check out this amazing UT4 Extreme. Thanks again to Ocoopa for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. So now that I have all these 7-inch strips cut out, I should have enough to make all my drawers today. So let's grab one of these strips and cut it down to length. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll cut the front and the back of our first box down to 19.5 inches. Once that's done, I can adjust the stop block to 21 inches to cut down both of the sides. And just like that, we have all the pieces needed to make a box. So now that we have all 4 pieces for our first drawer box cut to size, we need to cut a dado on the very bottom of each one of these pieces so that we can place a 1/4 inch piece of plywood on the very bottom of that drawer. Now you could do this a lot of different ways. Initially I thought I'd put a 1/4 inch dado into my table saw and just run the pieces right through the saw. And that would be very fast and efficient. However, the 1/4 inch plywood that I got from Home Depot is nowhere near a 1/4 of an inch. And I even did a couple of test cuts to see how well this would fit, but this is just way too loose for my liking. So I'm going to have to use a table saw for this process and creep up on that perfect fit. So don't rely on your dado stack that's set exactly to a 1/4 of an inch and assume that your 1/4 inch plywood will fit perfectly into that groove. Typically, it's going to be very loose. The last thing that I want to consider is how far do I want those dados from the bottom of those 7-inch strips. And since I'm using undermount drawer slides, I typically like to go at least 1/2 of an inch. Now you could cut this dado at a 1/4 of an inch if you'd like to have that extra 1/4 inch in your drawer. However, what I've found is when you cut it that close to the edge of the plywood, you're going to get a lot of chip out, and you may not get enough support for your drawer. So in order to create these dados, I first want to grab my 1/2 inch setup block so that I can set the fence on my table saw. Once that fence is set, I'll now grab my 1/4 inch setup block so that I can set the height of my blade. With my table saw now fully calibrated, I can now make my first pass for that dado on each one of the sides of my drawer box. And lastly, I'll run a test piece through so that we can make sure we have the perfect fit for the bottom of the drawer. Then I can tap my fence over just a tad and run my test piece through once again. After that, I'll just grab a piece of the 1/4 inch plywood that I'm using for the bottoms and test the fit. And since I'm satisfied with the fit on our scrap piece, I'll now do our second pass on all the other pieces. After that, I'll put all the pieces together and do a dry fit just to see how it looks. Now it's time to go back to our drawing to figure out the dimensions for the 1/4 inch plywood that will be used for the bottom of these drawers. And since we did a 1/4 inch dado on each side, we need to subtract 1/2 of an inch from the outside dimensions of the drawer, which gives me the dimensions of 20 by 20.5. So I'll set my fence to 20.5 and rip this entire sheet of plywood to that dimension. After that, I can adjust the fence to 20 inches exactly and do cross cuts on that same sheet of plywood. And to make this 1/4 inch plywood fit a little bit better into that dado, I just like to sand each side. And once I'm finished with that sanding, I'll just do a dry fit to make sure everything's fitting together nicely. And once I'm satisfied with the fit, I can then take it all apart once again so that we can glue this thing up. And for this first box, we're going to do this the easy way, using 18 gauge 3/4 inch brad nails and some glue. So one of the first things that I'll do, since I'm not worried about wood movement since we're using plywood, is I'll put a few dabs of glue into that dado. Once I've done that, I'll add a little bit of glue on one of the sides of the front of the drawer. Then I can align the front and one of the sides of the drawer, making sure that I'm sliding that 1/4 inch plywood into the dado. Then I'll repeat the process with the back of the drawer, adding glue to one side. Then I can add just a little bit more glue on the other side into that dado. And finally, I'll add some glue on the other side of the front and the back and attach the last side. Once everything's fitting together nicely, I'll then add my 3/4 inch brad nails on both sides of the drawer. Well, that's about as easy as it gets, and for shop furniture, maybe all you need. And if you were using side mount drawer slides, you could probably call this box done. But as I said earlier, we're using undermount drawer slides, so we do need to make one alteration. And this has to do with the very back of the drawer. Since this box will be sitting on rails, we need to cut a notch out in the very back. Now we're going to be using an easier method for the rest of our boxes, but I did want to show you this quick method. And all we're really going to need for this process is a router with a flush trim bit as well as a small flush trim saw. And what I'm really looking to do here is to remove the back lip of the drawer about 2 inches from the very side of the drawer. And we want this to be completely flush with the bottom of the drawer. And this doesn't have to be particularly pretty, as nobody's going to see the very back of this drawer. So let's get to it. So this is a little bit of a messy process, but it is easy. All I'm doing is flush cutting the back of the drawer so that it's completely even with the bottom of the drawer. And when I do this, I typically get a little bit of chip out, but that's okay. Nobody's going to see the back of this drawer. And we'll do this process on both sides of the drawer back. And once we're done with the router, we can take our flush trim saw and clean up all the corners that are rounded over. And with these little notches cut out, you can see how these drawer slides will sit completely flush on the bottom of the drawer. Well, let's move on to our second drawer box. And our second drawer box, in my opinion, is the second easiest way to make these boxes. Now for our second box, we're going to use the exact same dimensions for both the sides and the front and the back. So I'm not going to bore you with the entire process of cutting out these pieces again, and instead we're going to go right to assembly. So I've already got my 4 pieces for the drawer box cut out, including the dado. And you guessed it, we're going to be using pocket holes for this method. Now in order to use this method, it's going to be very important that you keep track of what's going to be the front and the back of the drawer box, as the front and the back will be the only 2 pieces that will get pocket holes. And in my case, I'm doing 3 pocket holes on each side, making sure that I'm paying attention to where that dado is. And what I'm trying to do is to get a pocket hole on the top and the bottom of the drawer, as well as one in the approximate center. With all of my pocket holes cut out, I now want to make an adjustment to what will be the back side of the drawer. And what I'm looking to do is to remove the material from the dado to the bottom of the drawer. So I'll take this back piece over to the table saw and slice off what's just a little bit over a 1/2 inch. And with that material cut off, you can now see the difference between the front and the back of the drawer. With all the adjustments made, it's now time for glue and screws. And I used a couple of clamps just to hold everything together until I got those screws fully seated. And I really like using this combination of these 90-degree clamps with the quick clamps. The 90-degree clamps hold it into place until you can get some pressure on it with the quick clamps. Once the front and 2 sides are attached, I can then slide in the bottom. And with that bottom in place, all I have to do is to add the back of the drawer. And even though everything holds together fairly nicely at this point, I still like to add a clamp just to make sure that nothing moves. The final piece to this drawer assembly is just to hold that bottom in place just by adding a few 3/4 inch brad nails. Well, that wasn't too bad. It's a little bit more effort on the front end, but it gives you a drawer that's just a little bit more secure. Now the next drawer we're going to make is probably going to be even a little bit more secure than that pocket hole drawer, but it's going to come at a price. And this is an assembly method that I would probably only use in a shop project. So let's check out this next method. So this is by far probably one of the quickest methods out of all the ones that we're taking a look at today. I'll first do a dry assembly with the front, 2 sides, and the bottom of the drawer. After that, I'll add a little bit of wood glue to the back of the drawer and clamp it into place. Once everything is secure, I can then pre-drill and countersink into the side a couple holes into the back of the drawer. And I'll do this process on both sides of the drawer. And just for good measure, I'll remove the clamp, pre-drill, countersink, and drive in a screw where that clamp was at. With the back now screwed together, I can flip the drawer over and repeat the process on the front of the drawer. Now a lot of you have been asking what type of countersink bit do I use? And it's really a toss-up between 2 brands. Here I'm using the Amana countersink bit, but probably my favorite bit to use is the Eason countersink bit, and I'll leave a link in the description below for both bits. Once I have all those screws in place, it's just a matter of brad nailing the bottom of the drawer into the back of the drawer. Well, that was almost as easy as making a drawer with the glue and brad nails, and you're going to get a lot of strength with this drawer. However, you just can't overlook the scars that will be on the side of the drawer. Now in theory, you could cover these up with wood filler, but you're still going to be able to see them in my opinion. So you're really sacrificing looks for strength with that method. But what if there was an even stronger method that had no visible scars on the side of the drawers? That's what we're going to do next. And this method is commonly called the quarter method. But in our case, since we're using undermount drawer slides, we're going to have to modify it a bit and do the quarter half method. So how does this method work? To understand it, we need to take a closer look at this example I created. This is essentially a tongue and groove joint, as the front fits right into the side of the drawer. So why is this called the quarter method? Well, it's really quite simple. Let's take a look at this diagram. If we take a look at this diagram, you can see that all the measurements that are associated with this joint are just 1/4 inch. Now, since this is a different type of joint for these drawers, it will affect the dimensions of the front and back piece of the drawer. And that's because we're going to have a 1/4 inch tongue on the front and the back pieces, which will make the dimensions 20 inches by 7 inches. And the sides will stay the same at 21 inches by 7 inches. And in order to make these types of drawers, I had to dig up Old Yeller, as she's my dedicated dado saw. And what you'll see installed in this dado saw are just the inside and outside of my dado stack that equate to exactly 1/4 inch. But we also need to set 2 other measurements to exactly 1/4 inch. And to do this, I would not rely on the measurements of your table saw, but instead grab a setup block. With that 1/4 inch dado stack in place, we now need to set the height of it to exactly 1/4 inch. Once we've confirmed that, we'll now set the fence to 1/4 inch from that dado blade. And that's all the setup that we need to do with the table saw. The first thing that we want to do is to create the grooves on both sides of the drawer box. Now, when you're putting these grooves in, I really recommend using a push block. And that's because since you're removing more material than you would with a normal table saw blade, you're going to get a little bit more resistance. And here you can see those grooves on either side of the drawer box. Now it's time to make the tongues on the front and the back of those drawer boxes, and nothing's going to change over here at the table saw. The only thing that we're going to do differently is we're going to run the front and the back of our drawer boxes vertically right up against our table saw fence. Now, it probably would have been a bright idea for me to use a featherboard in this situation. In fact, even a double stacked featherboard would probably be your best option. And with all those cuts made, you can see how the tongue on the front and the back will fit right into the sides on the drawer. Now, if my 1/4 inch plywood was exactly 1/4 inch, I could take this whole process one step further by creating the dado for that bottom piece by sliding my piece right across that dado stack. This would create that dado for the bottom panel 1/4 inch away from the bottom of each side. But as I said earlier, I need that dado to be 1/2 inch from the bottom since we're using undermount drawer slides. And I could just move my fence over so that it's 1/2 inch from the blade, but since my plywood isn't exactly 1/4 inch, I don't want to use my dado stack to make that dado. So instead, I just used my table saw. But let's put this thing together and see how it compares to the other 3 we've already created. So I went ahead and created the dado for the bottom panel of this drawer over at the table saw, and it's 1/2 inch from the bottom. Now, this type of drawer box is probably one of the easiest to assemble. With all of the tongue and the grooves, all you need to do is to add a little bit of wood glue and everything will square up perfectly. The only real disadvantage to this method is you're going to have to use clamps until that glue sets. Well, that takes us through all 4 different types of drawer builds. Now, although our last drawer box is extremely sturdy, there is one thing that concerns me, and that's that you do have to clamp it up until that glue cures. And that's a real issue for me, since I don't like to prolong the drawer building process any longer than it needs to be. So let's quickly go over the pros and cons of each drawer box. Now, this may come as a surprise to you, but I think the most enjoyable one to build was the very first one we made, with the simple glue and brad nails. The brad nails are barely visible, and this process went quick and easy. But we may be sacrificing a little bit of strength here. However, maybe not, as wood glue, which is holding this thing together, is extremely strong. Next up, we had the pocket hole screws, and in my opinion, this was extremely easy to build, and it's very durable. The only disadvantage to this method, in my opinion, is the extra time you need to spend on the front end to get all those pocket holes drilled out. The third method, and probably one of the stronger drawers we made today, was the glue and screws. Not only is it extremely strong, but it's also very quick to build. The only downfall to this method, in my opinion, is the exposed screws on the sides of this drawer. And lastly, we have one of the strongest methods of the day, the quarter method. Once you get all your calibrations dialed in at your table saw, you can really blaze through a lot of drawers at once. It's kind of like a set it and forget it. But the fact that you need to have this thing in clamps until that glue cures is kind of a deal breaker for me, as I'm not even sure that I have enough clamps to do 10 drawers at once. So what's my preferred method? Well, I think I'm going to have to go with the pocket hole screws. With just a little bit of investment on the front end, you can knock out these drawers fairly quickly and you don't need to clamp them up. Plus, they're probably one of the sturdiest drawers we built today. So I'm going to get to it and knock out my last 6 drawers using the good old-fashioned pocket hole method. So I spent the rest of the afternoon getting all these drawers set up so that I could assemble them all together. Once I got all the dados in for the bottom panels, it was just a matter of adding the pocket holes into each one of those fronts and backs of the drawers. And once I got all those pocket holes in, assembly was rather quick. Just a little bit of wood glue and a couple of screws and everything came together perfectly. And just like that, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 drawers. Well, that was a lot of work, and I still need to install these things and build drawer faces for each one of them. But I'll do that in a future video. Before we close this video out, why don't you let me know in the comments below what your favorite method is for building cabinet drawers. Well, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Also, make sure you check out my website, www.flynndogwoodwork.com. Until next time, take care as always. Thanks again to Ocoopa for sponsoring this video. To see how you can get your hands on this amazing Ocoopa UT4 Extreme, check out the links below and use the coupon code to get 10% off your order. From my experience, this might be the perfect holiday gift for that woodworker in your life.